Okay, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about these specific Roman ceramic vessels. I've given a couple of short talks before for the study group from pottery. Some of you might have seen, I think it's lurking on the study group's YouTube channel. So I'm going to be bringing on, building on some of that work, bringing in some new work, and a lot of it is very much work in progress. So you may have seen actually in the press recently that there was some prehistoric vessels that have been analysed using organic residue analysis, the prehistoric baby bottles, and that work as well just goes to show that the whole question over choices around breastfeeding, it's not a new debate. And breastfeeding, according to the World Health Organization, it is the most effective way of ensuring child health and survival. So in past societies like today, if there's a reason why breastfeeding, you need an alternative to breastfeeding, you need to find ways to adapt. The obvious one, obviously, is to use a wet nurse, but for that only works if babies can actually breastfeed. And as we'll be looking at, if there's reasons why they can't, then, you need to adapt and find other ways of feeding babies. And also when babies are weaning, so moving on from breast milk and having supplementary foods, like today, we use sippy cups, we use all sorts of other vessels. And since the late 19th century, these particular vessels have been cited in various reports. They've been charged with the role of being infant feeders. They're quite distinctive. We're going to look at some of I've been working on a typology for them. We've got over 100, about 120 now from Britain. That was my lockdown project, was scouring archives and finding them. And the main reason they're cited as being used for infant feeding is because of the context that they're found in, which is predominantly infant burials. Yes, it works. There we go. So going to talk about these vessels, have a look, like I said, at the typology, look at the distribution. They do have a very wide distribution. And then we'll look more closely at the distribution in Britain, look at how they might have functioned, various alternative uses that have been put forward for them, and some of the experimental and scientific approaches people have used to understand their use. I actually really like this picture. It kind of sums it all up, doesn't it? Found it in a sarcophagus of a child, therefore it is for feeding said child. So like I said, in lockdown, I first came across these vessels about 20 years ago. And then when I started at ASC, one of the first sites I was looking at actually had some more of these vessels. And researching those, we went into lockdown. So I thought, okay. So I spent quite a bit of time just looking through my old notes and just looking to see how many of them we have. And in those 20 years, there's been a lot more work happened on the continent. There's been some scientific work. There's a lot more data out there. So for those of you who haven't come across these before, okay, here's some nice pots. So they're small. They have a height range between 60 and about 150 millimeters. Rim diameters, they can be quite narrow, 60 millimeters up to about 100. As you can see in the images on the screen, it looks like there's a great deal of variety, but actually out of all of these, the vessel with the blue background and the one in the top right as you look at the screen, I think that's the same for the people online, isn't it? They're some of the most common forms. The biconical forms in the second row in, they're actually quite unusual. We don't get that many of those. You can see that they're, there is quite a lot of variety. They can have flat bases, bit of a foot ring going on there, pedestal rim foot going on, lots of variation in rim forms, and we get some with handles. They're more common to not have handles. When they do have a handle, more often than not, they're on the right. Occasionally, they're behind the spout. It's not very common to have a handle to the left of the spout, so I don't know whether the position of the handle, if you're right-handed, it works great. It's a bit more tricky if you're not. And some of them as well almost look to be imitating flagons. So on the bottom row, the third one in, sort of a bit of a ring neck going on there. Decoration, or the two on the end, most of the vessels we have in Britain are locally made. We have Samian vessels, so as you look at the screen bottom right, and above that is a Mosul ceramic that's on display, or it was on display at the Museum of London. It's the only one of those that I'm aware of. We do have a good representation in Samian. In terms of decoration, I'll just go back. So you can see they might be white slipped, they might be mica dusted. Otherwise, most of them actually are oxidized or just reduced local fabrics. In terms of decoration, don't really have much. The vessel top right, that's from Colchester, and you can see it's got the raised dots and it's got sort of barbotine leaves around the top. The vessel below is from London. The vessel in the middle, I love. Fiona Seeley's written a paper on these, and she linked it to Bacchus. You've got the little face, and you can see the hole where the spout would have been attached, and it's come off, and you've got the vine leaves. Didn't really have, apart from a few examples from London and Colchester, I'm not aware of any others decorated like this in Britain. The one on the far left, I found that the other day, that's from Freiburg. So it's a nice continental example, different shape, but again, it's got molded decoration. It's quite unusual. We don't seem to have that kind of thing though, really. And also they don't just occur in ceramic. Allegedly we have them, well, these glass vessels are also thought to be Tatine. You see them in the literature as Tatine or biberon. I don't think I would put that anywhere near one of my children. But you find them in infant graves, particularly on the continent. They're rare here. I think we've only got 3 from Britain. This particular one is from Lankhills, so it's been published. It's quite well known. You might recognise it. And this one was found with a child aged around 5. And what's interesting about this one is we've got 2 from Colchester, and the Colchester ones are dated 2nd to 3rd century. Hilary Coole's written about these. And this one was in a 4th century grave at Lankhills. So there's a thinking that actually it could have been around for like 100 years or so potentially before it was deposited. Some of the ones on the continent have been analysed and they have found traces of milk in them. I'm not sure on these ones. I think the spout's too low down and it's at the wrong angle. If you filled it, it would, I don't know. So I'm not going to be talking any more about the glass ones, but they are out there. I think it's quite interesting looking at the relationship between the glass and the ceramic ones, but not today. Oh, and actually, just before I finish talking about the shape, for the people here, there are 2 in the gallery downstairs. We've got 2. There's a couple on display at the British Museum. There's one in the gallery, Roman Britain Gallery, if anybody wants to go and see. So it's not just the context that we find them in. There's various other evidence that's being brought into discussing why these are or aren't infant feeding vessels. So there's quite a lot of literary evidence. There was Breast Bottles and Babies written in 1986, which brings quite a lot of this information together. But more recently, Francesca Fulminanti, and I hope I've said her name right, she's pulled together a lot of the ancient sources from the 2nd millennium BC Babylonian texts through to Roman writers, through to writings in the Byzantine period, medieval period. And what comes out of all of these is quite considerable consistency in patterns of cessation of breastfeeding at or around 2 to 3 years and the introduction of supplementary feeding around 6 months. So again, it's not actually different. Nothing's really changed. It's not that different to the current WHO guidelines and the UNICEF guidelines, which state exclusive breastfeeding, ideally for 6 months, and then bringing in supplementary food, but continuing breastfeeding for up to 2 years, because during that time, infants can get about 1/3 of the nutrients that they require from breastfeeding alongside with supplementary feeding. Yeah, so thinking, obviously we're talking about Roman Britain today, so Serranus and Galen are particular significance. Got a little quote from Serranus at the bottom there. My children would probably love to have watery wine, but it's not happening. So Cyrannus of Ephesus, 2nd century AD, in his Gynecology, he included 23 chapters addressing motherhood, infant feeding, various childhood conditions. And the forms of these vessels, they are comparable to those that he mentions in his Gynecology for administering supplementary liquids through artificial teats. Galen also wrote about feeding practices. He advised about introducing other foods when the first teeth come through. But he advocates continuing breastfeeding longer for up to 3 years, which is a slight contrast to Cyrannus, who says about 2 years. And that difference might be significant, actually, when you start to look at some of the other data that's coming out from across the empire and what's happening in Rome compared to what's happening out in the provinces. So Fulminata, again, she compared the historical resources with the data coming from bioarchaeological studies, of which we've got a good spread of those now, quite a sizable data set. They're spanning Neolithic Turkey, Belgium, Germany, Poland. We've got studies on Bronze Age populations from Greece and Poland, Middle and Iron Age Britain, Roman period sites across the empire into Saxon and medieval periods in England. And all these various stable isotope studies, based on bone collagen and dentine samples from infants, again, they're all showing basic broad patterns corresponding pretty much with the written evidence as well. Breastfeeding ceasing between 2 and 3 years, fairly consistent weaning patterns across the Roman Empire. But like I said, there is some evidence that those in the provinces perhaps weren't adhering quite so strictly to advice. So one site that's often cited looking at this is Isola Sacra. They looked at they plotted nitrogen samples in the order of age of death, and it showed significantly higher values in the first 2 years that then decreased quite quickly, showing that for that population, there was a relatively early cessation date for breastfeeding. In London and elsewhere in Britain, the period of breastfeeding does seem to have been longer. So stable isotope analysis on 5 individuals at Bayonesse, I said that right, up near Catterick. That showed breastfeeding could have continued potentially for up to 5 years. So quite different. So where breastfeeding is not an option, either by the mother or a wet nurse, like we've said, babies still need to be fed, and whether that's human or animal-derived milk. There are various other methods that can be used to get that into them. So spoon feeding, cup feeding. But if anybody here has ever tried to cup feed for a 5-month-old baby or younger, it's a very messy experience. So it brings us back to the third thread of evidence, the material evidence in the form of these ceramic vessels. The theory being that they were used pretty much like we would use bottles today. And we do have a really, really wide spread. So we have them vessels turning up in Neolithic Europe. We've got particularly late Bronze Age, early Iron Age in Central Europe, mainland Greece, that you see a big increase in them. Iberian Peninsula, Sicily, there is a really, really wide spread. And people have tended to focus on the ones from graves, so it's not always so easy to find them on other site reports. There's never really very many of them outside of grave contexts. But like I mentioned at the very start, organic residue analysis, looking to identify traces of the fats or lipids that have been absorbed into the ceramic body during use, has been used quite successfully. Here we go. This one's the one that was in the press. This is the work by Julie Dunn and Katharina Rebay-Salisbury and others. They analysed 3 vessels found in Bronze Age and Iron Age graves of children in Bavaria, and they did find traces of milk, ruminant milk, which they interpreted as being used to feed infants. It's not possible, unfortunately, to distinguish between whether it's human milk, cow, goat, or sheep. There's limitations, but you can tell from the strength of the signal if they were used repeatedly or if they were perhaps just filled at the point of deposition. In Britain, we don't have any prehistoric examples of vessels that could have performed whatever role these Tatine were doing, and the distribution at first glance does support them coming in with contact with the empire. There we go. So you can see here That's the current distribution. And there's some interesting trends. So we've got clustering on the North Kent coast, sort of into East Anglia, various other sites, most of which, you know, have some military presence or going on with them. So and you can particularly see up on the Antonine Wall and Hadrian's Wall. We've got them over at military sites at Usk, at Holt, down on the south coast at Dover. So a real mix of sites, rural and urban. I've recently just had one come up from, or two actually, from Dorchester upon Thames as well. Quite a few of the villas have got one or two examples. So there's a good range of sites. And in date, most of them appear to be 1st to 3rd century. The earliest ones probably are the one from the Colchester Child's Grave. And I recently came across burial from Winchester, not actually in the main settlement for Winchester, slightly outside up at Winnell. And there's a burial there, antiquarian site, and they had about 30 vessels in with one of these. And the same in quite closely dates it to AD 45 to 65. And I think that's probably the earliest that we have at the moment. Particularly like if we have a look at some of the rural sites where they turn up, this is a site in Surrey, Kingswood. You can see here it was a small group of burials, all infant burials. I think it was 5. One of them contained a Central Gaulish lead glazed vessel, which is the little rim with the decoration number 3. You can see it there. And that one's quite interesting on this site as well, because they tend to be sort of pre-Flavian imports. They do occur in graves in the Kent area. And there's also a suggestion that they might actually have carried water from the spa at Vichy. So it's interesting that that's here in one of the infant graves. And one of the other burials, number 5, you can see there, has got one of these little tatine, and the whole site is dated sort of 70 to 120. This is the site that got me back into these. This is the burial from Harlow. Harlow's a rural farmstead, and it had 4 cremations enclosed or encircled by a Penennial galley. All of the burials were unurned, but all had ancillary vessels, ranging from a single jar to this group, which is quite a lovely group, accompanying a young child aged between 3 and 5 years old. So you can see here there's a range. You've got glass beads, you've got various iron and copper alloy things going on. I like the ceramic vessels, and you can see here there's 2 of these spouted vessels, number 8 and number 7. It's really unusual to get 2. I haven't got any other sites where you have 2 accompanying one child. You've also got the classic Samian dish and bowl set, 4 and 5. You've got drag 35, drag 36. Quite rare for Britain, number 6 is a decorated Deschelette 67 beaker. There's flagons, a couple of courseware beakers. It's a really interesting little group, and in complete contrast to the rest of the assemblage. The domestic assemblage was what you would expect from a rural farmstead in Essex. You wouldn't expect this. And actually, the only other occurrence where I've had 2 vessels possibly buried together was an antiquarian find from Woodlespool, I think that's how you say it, up near Cheshire. And there were 2 vessels that were antiquarian finds, but allegedly they were found together. 2 oxidized flagons. The reports say that they had the cremated remains in them. I don't think they've ever been looked at. But what's nice about that is it's a pair, and they're both handled, one handle on the left, one handle on the right. So that's quite a curious little group. But going back to Harlow, and in this area of Essex, you do have a pattern of different burial traditions. So auxiliary vessels can either be sort of local jars, or you have this kind of Gallo-Roman drinking thing going on with flagons and beakers. So it's quite interesting to ponder why it is that the inhabitants at this farmstead felt a connection more to this burial tradition. So if we look at some of the larger settlements and their associated cemeteries, we can have a lot of antiquarian finds from both York and Colchester, cited from coming from infant graves. Roman Cemetery at Chichester has got 3, all in with infants. But one of the largest groups from recent excavations from a large cemetery are these from Pepper Hill in Kent. I actually worked on that one, so a long time ago. So one of the largest, like I said, this is one of the largest groups. We've got, so this site lay just south of the Roman town and the religious complex at Springhead. The excavation revealed almost the entire plan of this Roman period cemetery. It developed along the side of a road, but they had 558 graves and other funeral-related features at this site, of which they had 5 examples of Tatine, and you can see them here. They were 4 inhumations, and 1 was a possible cenotaph. So you can see 11245 there. It's thought to be a cenotaph, and Ed Biddulph, who wrote it up, wasn't convinced that that was a cenotaph. He thought it could have been a cremation, perhaps. Don't have the cremation surviving, but we do have other examples of possible cenotaphs for children. There's a lovely little site from the Eastern Cemeteries in London, Mansell Street, where milk teeth had been placed in a really tiny little miniature vessel that had been sealed by a coin. And the thinking is that could actually be a cenotaph burial as well. All of these vessels at Pepper Hill, they're all locally made, probably at Upchurch, particularly the one in the cenotaph. Jason Moynihan in his typology for the Thameside Upchurch Industries includes, I think it's Form 13 in his typology. So it's a nice little group. Talking about London, actually, the main cemeteries relating to population of London, we have 3 known from burials. 1 from the Northern Cemetery and 2 from the southern area, 1 at Great Dover Street and 1 from Lance Street. The burial from Lance Street is really interesting. Here we go. So it's a multiple burial of a young man aged around 16 of Mediterranean origin. You can see him at the top there. An infant of 9 months that was placed in his abdomen, and a young child of 4 to 5 years placed at his feet. And the grave goods you can see there. So we have a courseware cooking jar located near to the young man's head, and a Tatine and a flagon placed either side of the baby's head. But there are stark differences between Great Dover Street, which is thought to represent high status burials, got mausolea, walled enclosure, and Lance Street, which seems to be more sort of commonplace burial ground. So again, it looks like these vessels, that whatever role they're performing or representing, this universal need that they're fulfilling, is regardless of social status, perhaps. Without going off on too much of a tangent, the burial of infants with adult males, that occurs at other sites as well. We get it at Cirencester. And if we have a look here, Cirencester, this one's quite well known as well. We have a Tatine here buried with a young child aged around 2 to 3, and a rather lovely cockerel figurine. This caused quite a lot of local and national interest, understandably, when it was found. It featured on the cover of Current Archaeology. Replicas have been made. And Cirencester, again, it's a big cemetery. There was 450 inhumations in the first round of works in the 1960s. And then the works by Cotswold Archaeology, where this one was found, was another 120 inhumations and 8 cremations, but only 1 Tatine amongst all of those burials. And with this cockerel. And it's quite interesting that these Tatine, quite often, they are placed in quite significant groups or with interesting objects. And cockerels, there's the link, obviously, with Mercury, messenger to the gods. And this was interpreted as the figurine being placed in the child's coffin to ensure a safe journey, and presumably the Tatine for nourishment along the way. So there's the whole argument of, were they used or are they symbolic? Everybody knows this one, don't they? Colchester's grave. I've put this one in just to show, when I say about various connections between these vessels and things on the continent. So you can see here the blue arrow, the spouted vessel, but also you can see amongst their animal-shaped feeding vessels. This grave was written about by Hella Eckhart. I think it was in Britannia. But this the rabbit-shaped or hair-shaped pora. There's another one here, British Museum, 2nd century, Central Gaulish lead glazed, and also another one with a Tatine found in a cemetery in Kent. Again, it's an antiquarian find, rural cemetery, lots of burials and things like this going on. So, Harlow and Cirencester, like I said, these vessels are associated with older children, but we do get them occurring with very young children as well. And just to bring in some of the continental evidence, here's one from Champ-Madame de Beaumont. This was a really interesting site. So this site was 26. This is just from one of the burials. You can see the Tatine there, hopefully, in the front. 26 child burials here, of which 4 of them had Tatine, out of a total of 47 vessels, which is about 8.5% of the vessels were Tatine. And some of these were with young infants. I just want to have a look at some of the military sites. The military connection is interesting. These are some of the vessels that have been found on various military sites in Britain. So at Bearsden, a fort on the Antonine Wall, there's one from the topsoil from south of the Bath House. But I haven't actually got that one on there. Mumrill's also in Scotland, the largest fort on the Antonine Wall. We've got one from a ditch, presumed to derive from nearby occupation activity. Moving south towards Hadrian's Wall, Pierce Bridge, there's a complete example from the Southern Vicus. Really odd example from Barkham, signal station on Hadrian's Wall, where one was placed in, Barkham's number 2 on the screen, was placed in the backfill of an oven that had been dug into the earth bank. And there was a flagon and a dish there as well. So that's quite curious as to what that was doing there. Although there is one from a rural civilian site at Enfield in London. There was one recovered from an oven there as well. Who knows? At Dover on the south coast and at South Shields, back on Hadrian's Wall, we've got examples from demolition debris, deposits relating to barracks and buildings. And the Dover vessel was actually found in a building described as the builder's workshop. Its functions unknown. But the plan for that building is atypical for a fort, and it's thought to be one of the earliest buildings, possibly with a specialist function, short-lived lifespan. So who knows what that was doing there. If to do with military, the vessel was found in period 3A, dated to the late 2nd century. I've got an Usk vessel on here. I'm sure I did. Yes, number 16 at the top. So at Usk, they were being produced in the mid-late 1st century. They're Form 16 within the fortress courseware typology. They only had one at Usk, found in the same deposit as a lamp and classified as a lamp filler. And we do get other early military examples, such as at Nijmegen. And at Usk, all of the forms there in the report are said to be derived from Upper Danube Rhineland areas. But the occurrence of these vessels on military sites, I don't think it's that necessarily surprising. If we accept that actually, despite marriage bans, there were families around on these forts as well. Soldiers would have had families. We know on the continent, they had families at the forts, and we also have some of these vessels. So, for example, at Udenburg, Sophie van Hoot's been doing work there. She's had 2, one in the burnt debris, level 4 in the fort, and one from the construction pit of a water basin, both dating earlier than 350. So they're on forts everywhere. So thinking about if we move on to think about their function, looking at the small shape, small capacity, the size of the borehole is often cited because it can be tiny. It's hard to see how it would have worked at all on some of them. Excuse me for this. I did have a little play. I went and bought a Tommy Tippy cup. Other sippy cups are available. And the other one is a replica. Gilbert Burroughs, I think, did that one. And I just wanted to see, and the little holes on the Tommy Tippy cup, they're like 0.5 millimeter. They're tiny and free flowing. They are definitely free flowing. So that's with water. So, if you don't, you can probably see the little puddle of water behind the Samian vessel. That's because you actually have to tip it at quite a sharp angle. Otherwise it will just dribble down the spout. Did it again with milk. It's fine. And then I did it with oil, and it does just drip very slowly, even though the particular Samian replica here, it's got a wider borehole than most of the archaeological examples. They would be a lot narrower, so that would enhance that even more. And also when pouring, if you just put your palm over the opening of the vessels, it stops the flow completely, and you can control it quite easily. You get a nice drip, even though it's free flowing. If you just tip it. Where are we going here? Oh yeah, other possible uses. So I've already mentioned that they might have been used as, or they're quite often referred to in the literature as lamp fillers. At Ersk, also at Chichester, you have one of these vessels and a lamp from a grave. And at some of the villa sites, particularly Star Villa in Somerset, had 2 of these. You get them at Rockbourne Villa. They do crop up, usually just as single examples, but they're often described as lamp fillers. And you can pour oil out of them very slowly, but I've never had to fill a lamp for use, so I don't know how much you need to control your oil fill and reduce your spillage. Breast pumps. Okay, so the example I've put up there looks very different to our vessels, because that one is described as being a possible breast pump from Sicily. Who knows? With the I don't even want to think about it really. But in 2000 and 2003, Raquette and Loredan, they identified 6 types of ceramic and glass tettine, or baby bottles, and they said actually they weren't baby bottles, they were breast pumps. And Nadine Roquette, I don't know how you say her surname, apologies, did some experimental work by asking, I'm basing this on Google Translate because it's written in French and my French isn't very good, but apparently asking a woman who'd recently given birth to experiment using one of those bottles as a breast pump by holding it under her breast, and I can't quite work out how she created the suction, but sucking on the little spout to use it as a breast pump. Now, other researchers have quite roundly refuted their use as breast pumps. Chalavet has said that breastfeeding works on supply and demand, and a woman who's one of my other hats, I used to be an antenatal teacher and a birth doula and did a lot of work on breastfeeding counselling. And when a woman has a baby, basically her body doesn't know whether she's had 1 baby or 6 when it comes to the amount of milk that's produced. So that's why it's supply and demand, allow the baby to feed as and when, and it regulates the milk supply. So actually asking a mum who's quite recently given birth to use a breast pump, if the hormones are working, there's not going to be a problem with supply. So I can see why they're not sure about them as breast pumps, and I'm not convinced. And those spouts aren't particularly long, and if you can manually express, I'm not quite sure why you would need to use one of those vessels as a breast pump. Other people may disagree. That's for the discussion. Invalid cups. So they're quite often referred to as invalid cups, again, going back to the military connection and their occurrence on military sites. They've been mentioned quite a few times, and particularly by Peter Webster in 1981. And he was writing about the Samian form that I showed at the start. And, you do get, a fair quantity of these vessels at kilns associated with military. So I've already mentioned Ersk. We also get them at Longthorpe. There's various military contexts. But we do also get them at other kiln sites, such as Upchurch on the North Kent Marches, which I've mentioned, Rowland's Castle, the one from Cirencester, that was made in the local North Wilts oxidised fabric. So they may have quite a specialist function, and they're never a big element of a kiln's repertoire. So there's been a suggestion again that maybe they're almost special commissions. But, there could be a connection here. If you've got them at Longthorpe, Ersk, York, Colchester, if you've got a high level of medical treatment that you might expect at military establishments, there's that whole conversation, isn't there, about did they have hospitals on forts? Lindsay Ellison-Jones has written about the provision of medical care on the northern forts. But again, there were families there. So they could have been invalid cups for soldiers. But, that argument could be equally applicable to infants. So, breastfeeding is quite a complex process, involves the coordination of around 40 different muscles, lips, tongue, jaw, cheeks. You've got about 6 different cranial nerves all going on there, basically to enable and coordinate effective sucking, swallowing and breathing by the infant. It's quite complex. Babies have to work quite hard to actually get their breast milk, which is one of the reasons why modern society is introducing bottles to do combination feeding of breast and bottle. Needs to be done with care because they require different effort on the part of the baby. So going back to my antenatal teaching days, it's for a baby, it's the difference. Those of you who've done sport and you've had your segment of orange on the on the pitch and you suck the juice out of the orange, it's quite a different, I'm imagining everybody now trying this, sitting at home watching online, it's quite a different action to if you were to suck on a straw. If you were to put a straw into that orange segment and suck, you know, it's a very different mouth action, and it's quite confusing for babies when you're chopping and changing. So the reason I'm saying that is because Debbie Sneed has done quite a lot of work looking at these vessels. Let's move on. There we go, assisted feeding. So invalid cups for soldiers or possibly for babies. So Debbie Sneed has done quite a lot of work looking at whether these vessels, she's looking at Hellenistic Greek examples, whether they had a role in the care of infants. So she's looking at the arguments for infanticide and saying, actually, are these vessels and some of the other evidence showing that there was active assistance to help to feed babies who couldn't breastfeed. If a baby can breastfeed, you don't need a bottle. If there's some reason why a baby can't breastfeed, then you still need to feed them. So focusing on evidence from Greece, she cites evidence from the bone well in the Athena Agora. That's dated about 165, 150 BC. So they're associated with the remains of about 459 infants who all died within a week of birth, and several older infants were in there as well. At least 7 of them showed evidence for cleft palate, and there was one of these vessels in there as well, which she interprets, you know, is that showing a deliberate attempt, or is that accompanying at least one of these individuals who presumably required extra care? The only site we've got, I don't know if it's comparable, not really comparable to that, but it made me think about Uden Villa in Buckinghamshire. Yeah, Buckinghamshire. You might remember it as the villa that was thought to be a brothel, and they were practicing infanticide there. They had the remains of about 95 or 97 infants. And we've actually got one of these vessels from there as well, not in a very useful context. I think it was in a drain. We've got the spout from one of these vessels, and most people know that site for being possibly a brothel and infanticide, but an alternative theory that's come across was because all of those burials, I think, seemed to be within about 50 years. So there was an argument that maybe it was some kind of birth centre. Don't know. But it's an interesting one. But cleft lip and cleft palate, they're not the only condition that could cause feeding issues for a newborn baby. There's all sorts, there's a whole range of trisomy conditions, neurological disorders. Even being premature can cause problems for a baby. They might not have the muscle tone to be able to breastfeed. You know, and there is talk in sort of, you know, sources about 8-monthers, babies who've become ill in the 8 months, preterm babies. So, you know, maybe there is something in this. In modern societies, about 1 in 30 births result in a baby with some kind of birth complication of this sort. Recent figures, contemporary figures, for example, for cleft palate affects 1 in 700 babies, cerebral palsy 1 in 400, Downs 1 in 1,000. All of these things could potentially cause problems for babies breastfeeding. So if these vessels were used proactively to assist very young babies, then might in part explain why they consistently occur, but always at that low level. If you think about the size of some of the cemeteries that we were looking at earlier. In this figure here, we've got lots of representations of women breastfeeding. We don't have any of bottle feeding, and I need to thank Debbie Sneed again for hunting this one out for me. This is a 5th century BC figurine. It's the only known portrayal of an infant being fed with a bottle. Debbie's actually looked at the baby's mouth here and the fact that the woman's holding a like a towel or a cloth, and actually, is this a baby, perhaps with cleft palate? What's intriguing about that, though, is it doesn't really explain the presence of these vessels outside of infant burials and domestic spheres, where you would normally expect children to be. I wouldn't necessarily expect one to be in the signal fort at Barkham, for example. But maybe, you know, these were made for a very specific purpose. They do occur across geographical areas and chronological periods. There's obviously some universal need that they're fulfilling. And it might be that that's something that is mainly applicable to the young, but could potentially also be used for adults. So thinking about that, could it be, there's conditions that quite help with breastfeeding. It's not just birth conditions, things like mouth ulcers, colic, ear infections, all of those would affect the baby's ability to be able to breastfeed. Mouth ulcers in particular were considered very dangerous to children and life-threatening if they spread. We've got lots of Egyptian records showing how, the longevity of use for oral, nasal and ophthalmic preparations. If you think about these for dripping contents, barley water, milk, honey, all used as stomach, for easing stomach conditions such as heartburn, IBS, olive oil, earwax, I don't know. Certainly Pliny talks about babies troubled with curdled milk. They can be fed lamb's rennet in either water or vinegar. And one of these vessels would be good for something like that. And again, if you think about how you can control the flow and the viscosity of different liquids, maybe, we use blunt syringes now for Calpol, don't we? So is it really that different? I don't know. But the organic residue analysis, it's provided a range of lipid traces. Many do contain milk, but of course it's not going to pick up if there was something in the milk. And others have shown evidence of beeswax, honey, and possibly something fermented, which leads me on to this work in progress. And I think there may be some people online who are hoping that I'm going to come out with some amazing revelations, and sadly I'm not, not yet, because soon. So taking into account everything I've spoken about today, did a little project with Julie Dunn at the University of Bristol. Julie was involved with the prehistoric baby bottles, the ORA analysis that I showed earlier. And with funding from the Society of Antiquaries, we've analysed or taken samples from 30 of these Roman vessels from a range of contexts. And here I need to thank York Museums, Colchester and Museum of London Archaeology as well, for giving us access to their collections. We have had most of the results back, but not all of them yet. So I'm afraid, I was hoping today I would be able to talk about the results, but I can't. But basically, Julie's developed a minimally invasive sampling procedure, which involves the removal of part of the internal surface. You can see here, this is what she's doing. She's got a specialized drill. So she takes off part of the inner surface to remove any contamination, and then grinds off a small sample of the underlying fabric. And then that powder is analysed using gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. And by doing this, we're able to take samples that means that if some of these vessels are on display, but although it is a destructive form of analysis, but you can't actually see when they're on display because we're taking the samples from inside the vessels. They are quite tricky though. The prehistoric study, they were able to select 3 vessels that were quite open. A lot of the Roman ones, they've got quite narrow rims, and it's quite hard to be able to get in to where you'd want to sample the wall, really, where, if you think if they're holding liquid, you want to get sort of right in, and it's not always that easy with these vessels. And while organic residue analysis, it's good at showing some lipid fingerprints. Like I said, it wouldn't pick up if anything could be, like any herbal ingredients had been added to a base liquid. And I say that because anecdotally, I remember when my children were little, some of the other mums used to dilute polo mints in boiling water in their baby bottles. And then when the water had cooled down, they would feed the babies the minty water to deal with colic. So, we would, how would you pick up something like that? But, it could be something similar was occurring with these vessels. Maybe they're being used medicinally rather than medical per se. Some sort of infant liquid medications. It's as valid as a breast pump explanation, but it might also explain why they're found in some adult contexts as well. And their occurrence in Britain, it does seem to be directly linked to contact with Rome, whether that's through the movement of army and families coming, or just families moving over generally. We don't have anything like these vessels beforehand. So it does look like it's a particular form of childcare that's coming, or infant practice that is coming in with a new population. And going back to Lindsay Allison-Jones and the medical care on the Northern Frontier, you know, medical officers, if it was military policy that each fort had a medic, then just in that Northern Frontier, you could have 20 or so of them up there. And, you know, you think about the rest of Britain and people retiring, you know, that information would be there. So personally, I don't think they're breast bumps. I'm not convinced they were designed as lamp fillers. I think their use as ancient sippy cups is quite plausible. I'm not entirely convinced about the replacement for breastfeeding. The Serrano's quote about watered wine, that makes a lot of sense. As babies have less breast milk and they move on to solid foods, they're going to need that water element. Even with combined feeding, I don't know how much people know or would want to know, but usually when you're breastfeeding, the first part of the feed is very watery, and that's like the thirst quenching. And then the longer a baby feeds, then the more calorific the milk becomes. So they would need some form of watery liquid. And using those vessels for administering liquid would work. Water would work. But again, anybody who's tried to use a sippy cup or anything with a small baby, it gets very messy. And as soon as they grab them, they tip them out. We do see in Britain also, as well as this tatine, we do see a preferential, well, we do see selection of small beakers in infant graves. Particularly, I've mentioned Bayonessi already. It's quite clear in that cemetery population that infants are being buried with small beakers. And Nina Crummey's highlighted in her discussion of late Roman infant burials that small beakers, they are quite common in those burials. And in the absence of these vessels, they could be quite suitable for infant drinking. They're the right size to hold, easily grasped by small hands. And, it could be enterprising soldiers using these vessels for anything that requires a small, steady flow. I mean, who here uses vessels for a job that they're not originally intended? I know I do frequently. So hopefully our results will shed some more light on these. And we can try and work out what they were used for, but we'll have to wait and see. So that's it. Oh, and that is one of my children, and it wasn't a very successful experiment. You have to tip quite a long way back. He did get quite cross with that. So thank you. That's me done.